Yeah.
Oh, shoot on the road Japanese.
She's learning, huh?
Yeah.
All right, Isaac, open us in prayer and we'll get started.
Okay. Lord, thank you for this morning. Please grant us your wisdom and just help us to understand the things which we'll be talking about and think critically and just encourage us and just help us to be noble believers. In Jesus' name I pray.
Amen. All right, turn to John chapter 7. We're not going to read the whole passage, but I want you to see John chapter 7, verse 53, and then going down through John chapter 8, verse 11. And if you know anything about this passage, it's called the pericope adulterae. Yeah, that one. Get my glasses here. I knew there was a detail I forgot. The pericope adulterae, and those of you that are here on Friday nights, you know that I memorized through that passage. And I have to tell you that sometimes knowledge is a burden. Because I know that there is controversy concerning this passage, even while I was memorizing this passage, I kept getting distracted with thinking about the controversy, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to memorize the passage and draw out the spiritual truths from it alone. Obviously, I am convinced that it is a valid part of God's Word, or else I would not have memorized it. You're looking at 12 verses. I could have saved myself 2 weeks of time, but I really believe it's supposed to be there. It's often doubted as to the validity of the story concerning Jesus and the woman caught in adultery. There are those that claim to be experts. I'm not saying they're not. I'm just saying that that's their claim. And they say that this story should not be in the inspired scriptures. And I'll give you the reasons, basically 4 basic reasons. First one is that most of the ancient authorities omit John 7:53 through John 8:11. Those which contain it very much vary, V-A-R-Y, or are different, much from each other. That is a note that you would read if you looked at the bottom of the American Standard Version Bible. That's one of the marginal notes, I should say. Another reason is that some of the manuscripts which contain this passage place it in varying places in the text. So some people say, well, it's moved around from here to here to here to here. Some state that the story breaks the flow of the narrative from John 7:52 to John 8:11. So in their opinion, it should go to 7:52. They answered and said unto him, Art thou also of Galilee? Search and look, for out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. And then spake Jesus again unto them, saying, I am the light of the world. So they believe that it breaks the flow of the narrative there. There are, let me give you the 4th reason. The 4th reason is that there are 14 different distinct Greek words that John never uses anywhere else in the Gospel. So these 4 reasons that they give us sound like if you just stopped at that. And here's the thing, and I'm really big on this. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just trying to tell you what I believe to be the truth of things. And I think what we need to do is to be academically honest. That's why whenever we're going through these, I like to present to you why they say this or that, and then why I think this or that. And if you just stop at the arguments against it, it sounds pretty much like it's a good, open and shut case, as we would say, except it's not really that simple. The sheer volume of manuscripts that include the passage becomes a very strong argument for its inclusion. Does anybody know what the statement means? If I were to say, manuscripts should be weighed and not numbered. Has anyone heard that before?
Well, there's certain criteria which you can use to, say this manuscript is more reliable, more close to the original autographs, based on certain criteria.
Okay, so
carry more weight.
So manuscript is weighed based upon certain criteria. But the other half is not numbered. What does that mean?
I don't know. I know they number it just for organization.
That's not what I'm talking about by number.
Like
Let me just go ahead and explain.
Quantity.
I can't remember who was the first guy to say this, but the idea behind it is that you don't count how many manuscripts say a certain thing. Let's say you've got 50 manuscripts and they all say A B C D A B C D A B C D A B C D A B C D. You count that as one witness. Okay, it's one. And then if something says something else, then you count that. If another one says ACBD, that's another witness. If another one says AD, that's another witness. If another one says BC, that's another witness. So they're to be weighed. In that way of looking at it, you've got 4 manuscripts, 4 readings, and you weigh those readings instead of counting them, which is really convenient because that wipes out 5,000 plus Byzantine manuscripts, and that now suddenly becomes just one. You see what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is that, and I said the statement that the sheer volume of manuscripts that include the passage is a very strong argument for its inclusion, unless you think that manuscripts ought to be weighed and not counted. If you think that, it doesn't matter if you've got 50,000 manuscripts, it's only one. Does everyone follow what I'm saying? So it is true that some of the early manuscripts do not contain the passage, but which manuscripts and why? So it would be very helpful to consider the details in the discussion. The first extant manuscript to contain the passage is Codex Bezae, which is dated to roughly 450 AD, and it's a very mixed text with quite a number of variants. We're not using this manuscript to validate the existence of the pericope adulterae, but rather to identify a beginning point. Okay, so that's where the beginning point is, I guess you could say. So what do you find when you look at the existing manuscripts before Codex Bezae in 450 AD, which could possibly contain this passage? Understand that when we're talking manuscripts, we're not saying, oh, I found a manuscript, you pull it out and it's the whole Bible. It's not like that. It could be a page, it could be something as small as a postage stamp. So that's a manuscript. So when you look at manuscripts and you start talking about, is this verse supposed to be there or that verse supposed to be there, chances are good, we say that we have over 5,000 Byzantine manuscripts, you're not going to have 5,000 proof texts for John chapter 8. You understand what I'm saying? You need to go back and figure out which manuscripts have John chapters 7 and 8 so that you can take a look at those to see what's there and what's not there. So, what do we find when we look at the existing manuscripts before Codex Bezae, before 450 AD, which could possibly contain the passage? Now you understand why I said it that way. We have to consider all the manuscripts that are dated before 500 AD and contain this section of John. So that's what we're looking at. There are over 150 manuscripts dated before 500 AD, but only a very small percentage of these actually contain John chapters 7 and 8. That's where the pericope adulterae would appear. So here's what I have found in my research. You've got P66, which is an Alexandrian text, and it does not contain the pericope adulterae. I'm just going to say pericope from now on, okay? So you'll know what it is. So you've got P66 does not include the pericope. P75, yes, sir.
How many manuscripts do we have before?
Over 150. I don't have an exact number for you. It's probably bigger now since the last time I did any research on this. That's why I said over 150, because I know that there's at least 150. There's probably more than that. We've got some very major ones. The major ones are the ones that I'm kind of throwing out at you now. P66 does not include the pericope. P75, textual scholars have a high regard for P75's textual conformity to the Codex Vaticanus. It also lacks the pericope. It's considered to be Alexandrian. Uncial 01, does anyone know what that one is? That's the Codex Sinaiticus, okay. Uncial 01, it's Alexandrian. Although many corrections have been made which contain Byzantine readings, it still does not contain the pericope. So whoever was doing all the corrections, a lot of those corrections were bringing it back into line with the Byzantine, but here they didn't correct it. That's something to think about. Then you have Uncial 02. Any guess? Alexandrinus. Very good. Did you actually know that, or did you guess?
I guess.
Okay, well, you got it right. Codex Alexandrinus. Yeah, 50-50 shot, right? Codex Alexandrinus is Byzantine in the Gospels, Alexandrian text in the rest of the books. But there's no way of really knowing or really proving it wasn't in the manuscript initially, since the passage would have appeared on 2 leaves, and those leaves have been lost. So it's Byzantine. We think it was probably there because the Byzantine manuscripts had them, but we don't know. We can't prove it one way or the other because those pages are lost, okay? So that, as best, is an argument from silence. Then you have Uncial 03. Any guess? Vaticanus is the last one, right? Last major one. Uncial 03, which is Codex Vaticanus. It's the Alexandrian text, believed to be the standard, okay? It does not contain the pericope, okay? So for Brother Stephen, because I know he was out cooking and trying to get here and meeting and cooking and all of that, the pericope adulterate is John chapter 7, verse 53 through John chapter 8, verse 11. And it is argued that that passage should not be in the Bible, okay? So that kind of catches you up. Where are we at? Uncial 04, Codex Ephraemi Receptus. This is a mixed text, Byzantine and Alexandrian. It's one of the 4 supposed great codices. Codices are plural for codex, which is singular. Codex meaning a book. It does not contain the pericope, but interestingly enough, it does contain the long ending of Mark. Remember we talked about the long ending of Mark. It's got that, but it doesn't have the pericope. Yet the scholars who lean upon this manuscript as an authority do not use it to argue for the inclusion of the Mark passage. What did I just say? I just said that some of those people who support the Alexandrian manuscript will use this manuscript to argue for the exclusion of the pericope, but they won't use this manuscript to argue for the inclusion of the long ending of Mark. Why?
Does it have the long ending?
It does. You can't have your cake and eat it too. I don't know how many times I'm going to say that. If you're going to use a manuscript and you say it's valid, it's valid. If you're going to use a manuscript and say it's not valid, it's not valid. Okay, but you can't say, well, it's good to prove this, but then the other guy comes along and says, well, if it's good to prove this, it's also good to prove that. Oh, no, we didn't mean that. You can't do that. So, personally, if I come across a manuscript, and I don't come across manuscripts very often, they're usually like old scribbled notes that I stuck in my other books, that those are my manuscripts. But if I'm studying a particular manuscript, and this manuscript is a mixed text with Byzantine and Alexandrian, and it's all mixed up, I'm not using it as credibility for anything. What can it tell me? It can only tell me that particular passage existed. Whatever I see there, it tells me that existed. It doesn't tell me if it's good or bad. That's like walking into my library and finding the Book of Mormon and the King James. It doesn't prove which one is superior, it just proves that they're both in my library, and that's it. All right, let's move on. The Codex Washingtonianus, Uncial 032, originally contained the 4 complete Gospels, but now it's missing Mark 15, 13 through 38, John 14, 27 through 16, 7, John 1, 1 through 5, 11, and was most likely replaced by a later scribe. Byzantine in Matthew and Luke to the end, Western, Caesarean, and Alexandrian in other areas. Caesarean, by the way, is basically mixed text, okay? The passage in John where the pericope would have been written is Alexandrian, and the pericope is not there. Uncial 029, some people call it 0139. Mainly in agreement with the Alexandrian text, but a few people believe it also has a few Byzantine readings as well. The pericope would have been in the section of the manuscript which was translated into Sahidic, and it doesn't contain the pericope, okay? So there you have it. That's what we know about those manuscripts. The average Bible student is told to believe the lie that there is very little evidence for the inclusion of the pericope, but that's absolutely, undeniably untrue. Okay? Here's a defense that was made by a man named Dean John Burgon. He wrote a book called Causes of Corruption. And he said that Ambrose at Milan in 374 quotes it 9 times. Augustine in 396 about twice as often. It's quoted by Pacian in northern Spain, 370 AD, Faustus the African in 400, Rufinus of Aquileia, 400, Chrysosalus at Ravenna, 433, Sedulus, a Scot, 434. It's referenced by Victorius or Victorinus in 475, Vigilus of Thapsus in 484, Galatius, Bishop of Rome in 492, Cassiodorus in southern Italy, Gregory the Great, and that's not all. His list was quite extensive, and those are all the people that occur around 500 or before. So they quoted it. Lots and lots and lots and lots of people quoted it. So just because we have a handful of manuscripts where we can't find that, you got to wonder if it didn't exist, what were they quoting? There's a book that's mentioned in the book of Jude. It's called the Writings of Enoch. Does anybody know what I'm talking about? Turn to Jude and find that.
Which chapter?
Yes.
Verse 14, and Enoch also, the seventh from Adam. That one?
Yep. Go ahead and read that prophecy from the book of Enoch.
Yeah, I think it's 2 verses. We'll all read it. And Enoch also, the seventh from Adam, prophesied of these, saying, Behold, the Lord cometh with 10,000 of saints to execute judgment upon all, and to convince all that are ungodly among them of all their ungodly deeds, which they have ungodly committed, and of all their hard speeches which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. These are murmurers.
Okay, stop there.
Yeah.
Okay. So, all of that ungodly thing, that's from the book of Enoch. That's a quote from the book of Enoch. We know that Jude understood and knew this quote from the book of Enoch, and so he quotes the book of Enoch. You cannot quote something that does not exist. It must exist to quote it. If you want to, you could maybe make up a lie and say, I am quoting from the book of, Poindexter, and throw out a quote there. And maybe you could write that down somewhere, and somebody will read that and say, well, maybe that existed in the book of Poindexter, which I made up. That doesn't exist. But if you find a whole bunch of people spread out all over the continent quoting from the same passage in the same book, they didn't make that up. That's not something made up. It clearly existed. Otherwise, they can't quote it. And that's not all. Other than Dean Burgon's information, there are sightings that he didn't even mention, such as Didascalia Apostolorum. Why can't they give them simple names? Around 230 AD. It's mentioned in the Apostolic Constitutions in 380 AD, quoted by Jerome in 385 AD, quoted by Augustine in 420 AD. All of these people are quoting something that exists. You can't quote which doesn't exist. Now, take note that a good portion of the people on these lists are not quoting from the passage. Let me say that again. A good portion of the people on these lists are quoting from the passage well before the scribe wrote it down in Codex Vitae. When the scribe wrote Codex Vitae, roughly 450 AD, when he wrote that codex, people had already been quoting this passage all over the place. Why not? It's a wonderful, wonderful story. A woman who's caught in the very act of adultery, she's brought to Jesus, and the Pharisees say, okay, what are we going to do about this woman caught in adultery? Now, the law says we're supposed to stone her. And Jesus stooped down and he wrote in the sand. And then he stood up and he said, let he that is without sin cast the first stone. And he stooped back down and wrote in the sand. And one by one, those guilty Pharisees went about their way. And Jesus stood back up and he says, woman, where are those thine accusers? And she says, there's none, Lord. And he said, neither do I accuse thee. Go and sin no more. Incredible passage. Of course people are going to quote it. It's one of the most incredible stories in all of the Gospels. When you start talking about Jesus' forgiveness, it is implicitly powerful. Of course they're going to quote it. So just because we can't find it in a handful of Alexandrian manuscripts doesn't mean it didn't exist. Okay? So, since that's true, somebody has to explain why these men quoted a passage that supposedly didn't exist. And not just one or two guys. Like I said, anybody can make up a quote. Say, I am quoting from the book of Poindexter. Great. But we've got volumes of people that quoted this passage. And you have to explain every one of them away. And no one can do that. So, in short, of the 5 oldest uncials, only one of them even contains the disputed passage. 2 are damaged and have lost the leaves which may or may not have contained the passage. Only 2 of the uncials can truly be described as categorically not containing the passage. So it's pretty clear why the passage is not in the older and more reliable manuscripts. I'm speaking in sarcasm. It's usually what they say in line with the critical text crowd, right? That's what they say. The manuscripts are all Alexandrian, and the portions where the pericope adultera would have been written. In my opinion, the reason the critical text crowd denies the authority of the passage is because if the passage is received as authentic, then their darling manuscripts must be inferior. Did you follow that reasoning? So let me just point out one more thing that we should think long and hard about. If the pericope was in the manuscripts of the Byzantine family, and the Alexandrian family had fallen out of use, we have either accepted as authentic or come to the conclusion that for hundreds of years we had no pure word of God because it was corrupted. Like I said, we can't have our cake and eat it too. Let me explain that. Let me say that again in simpler forms. Since the Alexandrian manuscripts were not in use for hundreds of years, and since the Byzantine manuscripts have the pericope adultera, then what do we have to say? We have to say that for hundreds of years we didn't have the pure word of God? I can't say that. I can't come to that conclusion. Why? Because the Bible promises that God promises that he would preserve his word. Any questions on that?
I've heard someone talk about this as, he was on the other side of the aisle, and he said that, he believes it was a story of Jesus, but he didn't believe that it was inspired. And of course, did, if he wrote everything down, it wouldn't be able to fill the earth.
Right.
Or whatever. Hyperbolic language, but at the same time, not exactly hyperbolic, because Jesus did so much in his ministry that obviously these four Gospels that we say.
Well, he lived for 33 years. You can read through the four Gospels hundreds of times in 33 years, so clearly other things happened.
Oh, of course, and the Gospels are only focusing on 3 years, you know? So that was like one argument that I heard, like, oh, that's an interesting point that he thinks, but obviously he got other problems with why he comes to that conclusion. But I think it's also important to note that, like, where there is people quoting it, you know, if there was a debate of it, whether or not it existed, there would also be, at that same time of the quotes, an equal, if not greater amount of people arguing against it. Just like we see in many debates of the doctrines. What was that guy called, Marcion or something like that?
Yep.
Who said a bunch of stuff, but we don't count him as, or his writing as that important, because there's so many other people at the same time arguing against it.
Yeah.
So if these people, and in the first, second, third, fifth, whatever century, quoting this passage, and it was wrong, we would hear a lot more Christians arguing against it. Is that a fair?
Yeah, see, that's the thing. You know, when we're talking about evolution, and I'm just going to get you an illustration here real quick. When we talk about evolution, one of the big problems with evolutionary theory is that we don't have any transitional species, right? So we've never found the missing links. It just jumps from one species to another. As a result of that, a guy named Stephen Golden came up with a new theory called punctuated evolution, where we just suddenly jump from monkey to man, or whatever, in a very short period of time, because they can't validate the theory without the missing links. There should be as many or more transitional species as there are bona fide species, right? So in other words, if we're supposed to go from fish to salamander, there should be at least one, if not more than one, probably more than one, transitions between fish and salamander, but we can never find the transitions. We find fish and we find salamander. We don't find anything in the middle. Well, now let's keep that in mind as we're now looking at the manuscript evidence. What we're finding is there are no, you look at the writings of all of these people, and everyone is quoting from the pericope saying, this is part of God's word, this is what happened, Jesus did this. But you don't have anybody on the other side saying, yeah, but that story was actually included later. You don't see any of those kinds of arguments until we get into the 1800s. So for 1,800 years, no one disputed this. Now, I'm frankly not prideful enough to say that 1,800 years of Christians were all wrong. I'm just not that prideful. All right? Anyone else on that? Okay, let's move on to one of my favorite terms, the term only begotten. Only begotten. This was a big issue when I went to, where did I just go? Kenya. When I went to Kenya, they were struggling to find a good way to translate only begotten. And so I was given the homework to study out only begotten. All right. So this is the next issue. The English phrase appears in the Bible in 6 places. Who has one of those really cool little Greek pop-ups where you can type in only begotten phrase? You can do that in eSword if you want, and give me the references. We're going to look at that later, but just to satisfy everyone's curiosity, we'll look at that now. Only begotten. That's the phrase. Okay? Anybody find the references? All right, what are they? Yeah, we're not going to read them. I just want you to give me the 6 references, so if anyone's curious, they can jot that down. John 1:14. John 1:18. John 3:16. John 3:18. Hebrews 11:17. And 1 John 4:9. Those are the 6 places, okay, where we find this term only begotten, okay? The English phrase is in 6 places. However, it comes from a Greek word, monogenes, which is found in 9 places. Don't you love that? You're like, what? We'll get there, okay? Just setting the stage, I just want you to know that what we see in English is not what we see in Greek, okay? It's found 9 times in the New Testament. Now, how you decide to translate monogenes will affect the different verses that use this phrase, and there are 5 places where this phrase is used for Jesus. So naturally, you want to get that right. We are talking about Christ. We're talking about the character and the person of Christ in 5 of those verses, so we really want to get that right. Okay? Now, there are 4 overarching laws in Bible translation that must be followed. The first one is accuracy. We believe that we want a formal equivalent translation of the Greek and Hebrew into the target language. In our case, it would be English, okay? We want it to be accurate. In other words, we want the English to say accurately, word for word, as best as possible, what the Greek and the Hebrew said. That's called accuracy. Now, you know and I know that languages are different. Their construction is different. For example, in Korean, they do not say I love you. In Korean, they say I you love. So you got to kind of move some phrases around to make the grammar correct. But other than that, you want it to be as accurate as possible to be a formal, literal equivalent. That's accuracy. That is the first overarching law. The second one is what I call just simply theology. In other words, while you are translating, you must make sure that you don't, because words can have more than one translation. Monogenes is a good example of this. You want to make sure that whatever you choose is theologically right for that word in that circumstance. Does everyone follow what I'm saying? We saw this last week when we were looking in 1 Peter, I think it was 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 2, where the critical text says unto salvation or in salvation or with regards to salvation, and the Textus Receptus has nothing about salvation at all. And so we use the Textus Receptus, so we're not worried about that phrase at all. But if I were a critical text guy, I would be a little concerned about people that translated it unto salvation, because now suddenly you have to work to be saved. That's not theologically accurate. You follow what I'm saying? So it has to be accurate, it has to be theologically sound, and it has to be consistent. In other words, if you're going to translate 자동차, what is that? Car. If you're going to translate 자동차, car, in the book of Jim, chapter 1, verse 1, then when you get to the book of Jim, chapter 4, verse 5, and you see 자동차, you still want to translate it as car. You don't want to translate it as automobile or Ferrari or something of that nature, right? That's called consistency. Now, consistency is affected by the way words are used in different contexts. For example, when I was in high school, if we took a test and we didn't do very well, we would say, I bombed the test. I think we still say that. Some people say that. I bombed the test. Meaning it didn't go well, right? Or you could look at a girl that she was maybe pretty, and you could say she is the bum. Now suddenly that's good. And it's the same word, bum. It's just the context that changed everything, right? We do the same thing. I like the word bad. Bad's a good word, right? Nowadays we don't say, I could feel bad, which means I'm sick. Or I could say, that was bad. And now suddenly it's good. Bad is good because I said it was bad, so it's good. Now it's sick, right? Sick, which means it's not sick. You're not really sick. You could say, I'm sick. And we do say, I'm sick. But then a lot of people say, sick, and that's not bad. Now suddenly that's good. Languages are weird things. But inasmuch as possible, when the situation or the surrounding of that word is consistent, then that word should be consistently translated. So you've got accuracy, theology, consistency, and then the last one we call readability. Now you'll notice this, that you could take there's a translation called Young's Literal Translation, okay? I think it's Young's Literal blah blah something translation. Young's translation. It is an accurate literal translation of the Textus Receptus, but it puts the English words in the kind of like the Greek word order. It's not really meant to be a Bible to use. It's meant to be something that Greek students would use to study things with. But if you read that as a translation, you'd be like, what? It sounds like Yoda did the translation, you know? You wouldn't want to use that because it's not very readable. So these 4 laws are important: accuracy, theology, consistency, and readability. Now, getting back to let's see, can we remember that? The 4 overarching laws of translation, what are they? Have I just failed as a teacher? Oh, wait, what? No, oh, wait, what? Me? Come on, 4 of them. Accuracy, theology, consistency, and readability. We must remember those, because in a case like this, in monogenes, we can examine the Greek word, we can follow it through the New Testament, and we can see how these laws apply. In the King James, the translators were very accurate and very consistent in how they approached this particular Greek word. Due to the fact that Jesus is the Son of God in a way that we are not. I am a son of God. You're a son of God. If you're saved, you're a son of God, but we're sons by adoption. Jesus is not. He is the Son of God in a way that we are not. They chose to consistently use this term, only begotten. I'm going to give you some verses and kind of throw out some information to you. John 1:14, Jesus is the only begotten of the Father. It's singular masculine. John 1:18, the only begotten Son, singular masculine. John 3:16, only begotten Son, singular masculine. John 3:18, only begotten Son, singular masculine. 1 John 4:9, only begotten Son, singular masculine. So in those places, they did it exactly the same every time. In other places where the Greek word monogenes is used, they used a phrase like only Son. For example, Luke chapter 7 and verse 12, where it says the only son of his mother, it's singular masculine, but it doesn't apply to Jesus, so they didn't say only begotten. In Luke chapter 8, verse 42, it says one only daughter. The word there is singular feminine. Obviously, this word's not reserved for males only. It could be used for females too. Then you have Luke chapter 9, verse 38, where it's just translated only child. It's singular masculine. They could have said only son, but they said only child. There is one place where they chose to use only begotten for a person other than Jesus, and that's in Hebrews 11:17. So turn there. Hebrews 11:17. And Brother Stephen, can you read that when you get there? Mm-hmm.
By faith, Abraham, when he was tried, offered up Isaac, and he knew that and received the promises, offered up his only begotten son.
Initially, you think that Hebrews 11:17 was inconsistent, but actually they were extremely consistent. Isaac was the only son of promise, the only son through whom the covenant line would continue. He was uniquely born through a miraculous promise to Sarah in her old age. Ishmael was born naturally. Isaac was born supernaturally, representing the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan. So the writer of Hebrews uses monogenes not in the biological sense, but in the covenantal and theological sense. Isaac was the one-of-a-kind son in the lineage of promise. And you noticed something. What was it?
Well, I mean, Isaac is a picture of Christ in this.
Yes.
You know, it's very important. Abraham had other sons, as you mentioned, Ishmael, but even after Sarah died, he
married another woman and had six more sons.
They were all very special to him, fathers of nations, but in this context, Isaac is not just the father of Jacob, the father of Israel.
He's not just a son, he is
the only begotten son offered up as a sacrifice.
Yeah, so they use this word monogenes as only begotten consistently to stress uniqueness and special status, not always biological exclusivity. This is what we call theological accuracy. Okay, it's consistent with its use for Christ, though Christ's sonship is far greater in scope, being eternal and divine. So the different usage is a contextual application on the same term to two very different kinds of sonship, one earthly and one typological, or Isaac, and the other eternal and divine, being Christ. Okay? Let me give you some other observations and then we'll wrap it up. I got about a minute and a half here. Let's see what we can do with this. Monogenes does not exclusively describe sonship, for if it did, it would not be used in a feminine, masculine way. Did you catch that? It is used that way. It is more the idea of a uniqueness in a relationship shared by none other. John exclusively referred to Christ when using this term. He never applied it to others. John never used this word outside of, using it for Christ. It's commonly thought that the nobleman's son, mentioned in John chapter 4, verses 46 through 53, it's commonly thought he was an only son. You can't really prove that. It's just inferred from the context. But if that's the case, John could have used monogenes to describe this son, but he never did. So if we wanted a word to describe the uniqueness of Christ's sonship, and I think we should have something, then we need two different ways to translate monogenes. Do you see how that works? In order to be theologically accurate, and that's what they did. All right, so we'll stop here. We'll come back next week and talk about italicized words. Any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Just an interesting little comment. This word monogenes.
Yes.
With the list of verses where it's used, it's also interesting on who is using this word and how they use it. So those three references outside of the main six, Luke, written by Luke, he didn't use it referencing Jesus ever.
No.
The one asterisk in Hebrews, well, author Paul or the author of Hebrews, whatever you want to say, but the really interesting one is that the way John uses it is always referencing Jesus, and that's consistent in his Gospels and in his epistle, 1 John. So that's another little interesting factoid about the word, is that it's not, it's also who is using it and how that author uses
right.
it.
So John never uses it for anyone other than Jesus.
Yeah, and it's interesting how it can be a common word that's used by everyone, but one person uses that word in a special way. I think there's also arguments on that same way of like talking about why we believe Hebrews was written by Paul, because I've heard there's consistencies between Paul's other writings and the writings of Hebrews that match.
Well, you certainly want to use, if you know a certain person wrote, this book or maybe even other books, and they're using a particular word a certain way, you would find that consistency throughout all the writings where they use the same word the same way. That's what we do. That's the way
we
writers
find that nowadays. There are certain words that I use in certain ways, and certain words that you use in certain ways, and it's our flavor, if you will.
Right. Okay, anyone else?